And now we have Herb Levine, one of the organizers, who is a University Distinguished Professor of Physics and University Distinguished Professor of Bioengineering, so very appropriate here, interdisciplinary, who will give us our first talk.
Okay, yeah, so you forgive me, I was going to give a talk introducing more specifically biological physics applications, but it's going to serve as a general introduction for the area of applying machine learning in physics in general. And my goal is not to give you any technical details. My goal is to use a couple of examples as a way of asking questions that I hope we can discuss in great detail over the next 2 days. And also the talk will be sort of my personal perspective. That's what you get to do when you get to be old enough, as you sort of begin to look back on all the things you learned in earlier parts of your career that reflect on what's happening now. So, as I'm sure all of you know, but just to sort of get you thinking in the right direction, AI is very cyclical in terms of what we think about in terms of its efficacy in solving the world's problems. This is a graph of sort of the 3 phases of AI that we've gone through in my lifetime. The original phase, which now tends to be called good old-fashioned AI, sometimes abbreviated as GOFI, and the second phase, which is called expert systems, and the phase now, which we can basically refer to as machine learning. And the 2 earlier phases were, great excitement, lots of interest in it, and they sort of, in my perspective, fizzled out. To give you my personal example, in the early 80s, I was at a laboratory in a company called Schlumberger. Schlumberger is in the business of data interpretation. They make measurements in oil wells and try to determine what's the best way of extracting the oil from those wells, given those measurements. They measure conductivity, they measure magnetic resonance imaging, a whole bunch of very sophisticated measurements done inside oil wells. And they had a very large program on expert systems, where expert systems, for those of you who don't remember or don't know, were cases where you would have long interviews with people who were human interpreters of data, and you would try to encode that information directly into AI programs, and then, of course, see to what extent those AI programs could do better or at least reproduce what the human experts were telling you. And it didn't really work in the end of the day. I didn't really think it was working in those days, and I don't think historically it's proven that that was a very successful endeavor on average, of course, with probably some given exceptions. So the first 2 times, this didn't work very well, but unfortunately, if you look back, there's lots of hype. So I can ask the audience, how many people recognize some statement like this? There are in the world now that machines that can think, learn, and create, their ability will increase rapidly until the range of problems they will handle will be coextensive with the range to which the human mind has been applied. So I don't know if you know where that statement comes from, but the answer is, it comes from 1958, from Newell and Simon. So there has been a sort of, over appreciation, let's say, and over optimism about how well things work. And the question now that's facing us is, maybe the 3rd time is the charm. Maybe now, with machine learning as it is now, with our new way of thinking about it, maybe this time it really will, have all the benefits that have been forecast for a very long time. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. I've sort of entitled them sort of whimsically AlphaFold to the rescue, the case of Hallison, getting rid of pathological relationships, in other words, interpreting images via machine learning, and then the field of omics, which, for those of you who don't do biology, you cannot go to a biology talk or read a biology paper where there isn't some large-scale omics, as in looking at the genome or looking at all messenger RNA molecules at that scale and then trying to interpret it with some type of machine learning. Okay, so let me get started. So again, from a personal perspective, and I don't know if Yuhai remembers this, I'm not sure he was at this talk, but he was at UCSD at that time. Terry Sanowski, who probably most of you know, came and gave a physics colloquium when he first moved to the Salk Institute. And the physics colloquium was circa 1990, and it was based on this paper he wrote, predicting the secondary structure of proteins using neural network models. Now, this is really early, right? This is when neural network models were very much out of favor because of the work of Minsky and Papert and things like that. And he was very much involved in the revival of those methods. So he came and gave a talk about protein problems. And I was a young faculty member at that point, and I was very unimpressed, I have to say, because we had a large group, including Jose, who worked on protein folding and protein problems, and they were doing much better in terms of their capabilities than this neural network model that Terry Sinowski was talking about. The results were very unimpressive, and I thought, why would you do this? Why would you ignore all of molecular biophysics and all of physical chemistry in favor of just learning by examples? And the answer was true in 1988, but of course I wasn't thinking 30 years ahead. So 30 years ahead, in fact, learning by examples really does seem to work much better. It works so well that now AlphaFold has been made into a verb. So if I look at the bottom here, can we AlphaFold our way out of the pandemic? I don't know the answer, but it's sort of an amusing sentence. So we can ask the question, what happened in that period of time? So 4 things happened, and we can take votes, and we will discuss which things are the most important. So I listed 4 things that have happened in that since 1988, that original paper that I know of by Terry Sinowski, and now AlphaFold and all its various derivatives being used in the protein folding field, which we'll hear a lot about from David Baker later this morning. So the answer is, if you look at the things that are on this list, there's tremendous progress in basic physics and chemistry, creation of very large databases of actual crystal structures for proteins that serve as the template for learning, breakthroughs in deep learning theory, orders of magnitude increase in computation. So if I tried to label these things, I would say it's very clear that those 2 things were absolutely necessary. There's no way we could do anything that we were accomplish now without having the data. And this has been a heroic effort in the structural biology community for decades. And also, we need the computer power. The computers that were available in 1988 to do this, of course, just could not be doing it. And so the question is the other 2, and here it's a little less obvious. So there have been breakthroughs in deep learning theory. Are those absolutely necessary to have accomplished this goal? I don't know. That's something for us to discuss. And then Jose is certainly going to comment about the extent to which breakthroughs in theory, which are clear and which have really accomplished a lot, are actually necessary. So the way I can describe it is, if we take a graduate student, lock them in a room, not let them read any paper about protein folding since 1988, but let them have access to all the modern theories of machine learning, how well would they do with the problem? Do they really need to know what people in the community learn through very hard, very innovative work on protein folding and experiments related to protein folding theories? That's something which we can discuss in the meeting. Second example. So there's this book, which I don't know if any of you have read other than me. I read it because of the author list is quite amazing. It's Henry Kissinger, who you all know, Eric Schmidt, who was the head of Google, I think when he wrote, maybe not anymore, and Daniel Huttenlocher is the sort of leading AI researcher. And they wrote a book about the future of AI. And of course, most of this is about things like autonomous killer robots, which we're not going to discuss here. But in a chapter of this book, they talk about the case of Halicin, which is a newly designed antibiotic that was touted in the book, and I've sort of copied this along with my own emphasis. The deep learning algorithm came up with an antibiotic that was completely different than those developed by human reasoning, could not have been accomplished by humans. So is this true? I mean, this is an amazing statement that the book makes, that the machine learning algorithm trained, we won't talk about the details of this paper because, of course, that's not my goal here, but did it really do something that's beyond what human reasoning could have done? Well, it's sort of interesting. If you read the paper, which I then read, the answer might be yes. This antibiotic does things that are really not accomplished by all the antibiotics that in some number of decades we've actually developed. It's effective against a wide range of different bacteria. It doesn't seem to suffer from one of the main things that I actually have worked on, which is the notion of persistence in the face of antibiotics, which is an idea that some bacteria, for whatever reason, are just insensitive to giving bacteria. Those are called persisters. They persist in the face of otherwise lethal antibiotics. There's a wide range of people interested in understanding this because it occurs not just in bacteria, but also in anti-cancer treatments. And the question is, this thing somehow doesn't suffer from the same problem. The bacteria cannot avoid being attacked by this, even small subpopulations. And again, in the paper, it's claimed that that what they see is analogous to what's been claimed for chess or Go, is that some aspects of the design are things that have just not been anticipated in the human community developing antibiotics, which is similar to the statement what you see that chess moves that had never been found in hundreds of thousands of years or whatever playing chess or Go were developed by some of these computer programs in their route to winning the championships. If we move up in scale, then the idea of applying machine learning to biological problems is certainly not limited to the molecular scale. There's an entire community now that's interested in applying image processing methods to images of cells and images of things larger than cells, tissues. In the bottom of the slide, you see standard pathology slides that are used routinely in hospitals to try to figure out not only if your growth in some organ is cancerous, but also what stage is it, what might be the relevant treatment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole field of pathology going back, starting with single cells in 2007, paper by George Church, papers then using machine learning to analyze those cell images, and onward to many, many applications today. So in 2018, I went to an American Association of Cancer Research meeting and listened to a presentation by Google. And their presentation, they had two guys up there, and being extremely careful to repeat over and over again that they were trying to develop machine learning techniques and programs that would augment the effectiveness of the pathologist. Now, they were doing this because they were talking to an audience where 1/3 of the people were probably pathologists. But if you actually if you go back in 2017 and look at the advertising copy from Google Brain or whatever, you see that that's not what they're really doing. What they're really doing is saying things like, well, our algorithm can detect 93%, whereas a human is only detecting 80%, so you should just replace the humans by us. And so they didn't say that in public, but that's clearly what the thought is that it's not just you're going to create a tool that's helpful for the pathologist, maybe make his work simpler, but also just replace them. Now, if you think that way, it leads to a whole bunch of questions. So are humans going to be necessary? So there are papers which claim yes. So in this space of interpreting images of cells or tissues, there are papers that argue that it is useful to have a human in the loop, that you can read the details here, having to do with error correction, having to do with special cases, whatever. But I think it's an open question about whether these image applications in the biological context really will essentially need a human in the loop. It also is a very interesting question to me, and this is sort of more general, thinking about physics versus biology. There's a big difference, in a sense, between these two hypothetical scenarios. The first scenario is Google sends their engineer or their marketing representative to Boeing and says, you have all these people in your lab doing wind tunnel measurements, doing Navier-Stokes calculations. Do we need them? Can you just replace it with a machine learning algorithm? Or going to a hospital or a biolab, a biotech lab, and saying, you have all these people trying to understand these images and understand what's going on. You don't need all those. Can you replace it with a machine learning algorithm? In the first case, we know that there is a ground truth physical model, that if we only could solve that ground truth physical model, that we'd probably get the right answer. There's no reason to think that the Navier-Stokes equation or extensions to compressible flow or whatever is really the wrong answer for studying aircraft engines. I mean, if we could just solve those problems, we can't. So machine learning might think about helping us figure out how to better tackle those problems that are beyond what we can do just directly. In the case of cell biophysics and pathology, there is no such model. It's not like we are just saying we can improve the speed in which we can understand what a model is doing. There is no model. It's all phenomenological. So maybe the model generated by the machine learning algorithm is better than the model generating by our attempt to summarize what we see experimentally. One last example, and then just my closing slide. I think I'm on time. Oh, okay. So in the biology world, there's not, the idea of machine learning has spread from analyzing images to the analyzing of omics data. So I mean, omics is just the catch-all phrase for any time you evaluate something to do with the biological networks governing cell or organ or organism behavior, but you, instead of having the traditional way in which a biology web would do that would be to look at one pathway or one protein-protein interaction, one interaction. You somehow have developed a technology which enables you to look at those things on a whole genome scale. So you measure the concentrations, for example, of thousands of different RNA molecules in the same cell. You look at protein interactions between protein pairs of many, many thousands at the same time. So there's a revolution in terms of technology that has enabled that data to be collected. And of course, then that offers the possibility of saying, well, you know, maybe we need machine learning to actually understand what's going on in those systems because they're so rich in data, yeah, I'm fine, so rich in data and so complex that they're just beyond our ability to understand them using human reasoning. So this leads me to sort of, you know, my final slide, which is that I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks about this. And the questions one can ask yourself when you're just thinking about this and making up a talk is, well, will deep learning provide a methodology which dramatically improves our ability to do quantitative predictions? I think the answer to this is almost obviously yes. I think it's already doing this in many areas. Will there be any use for conventional theorists left over? Well, that's a good question. So being a conventional theorist, that's sort of relevant, except that I'm close to retirement, so maybe it's not so relevant for me. And then perhaps more generally, you know, if you think about this and take a step back and sit there with your coffee and, you know, feet up on the recliner, you can ask the question of, well, you know, we know for sure that our sensory abilities are limited, and we do lots of engineering work to develop things that augment our sensory capabilities. We develop night vision goggles. We develop ways in which we can listen to sounds that are beyond the range of our human ear, you know, on and on and on. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just says that, you know, we're limited. We're just designed to exist in a certain environment, a certain evolutionary pathway led to us. Well, maybe the same thing is true about human reasoning. Maybe our reasoning is limited and we need to develop tools that can extend the range of human reasoning to areas in which we just are not able to do it by the basis of the construction of our brains. I have no idea if that's true, but it's interesting to think about as we go down this road and as people start saying, well, the machine learning algorithm came up with solutions that we just never thought of before, that we don't really understand, and we just tried to put together. So in order to answer this question, you know, I turned to some, you know, wise oracle, otherwise known as the current modern language processing program, GPT-3, is that what it's called? If I'm remembering the name correctly, and just ask them the question, you know, because after all, if it's beyond our reasoning, why not ask the computer? So if you type in, is deep learning the answer, into GPT-3, you get back something which makes sense, although it's not very deep. It says, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. Deep learning is powerful. It can achieve impressive results, but it is not always the best solution. There are a variety of factors that need to be considered. So whether that's true or not, that's what we're here to discuss over the next couple of days.
You probably have seen this question many times.
Could be. I don't know. But is there feedback that people then react to the question and it updates? I don't think so. So whether it's seen this question many times, I don't know. But this is what it gives you. So I just figured this was the state of the art of our reasoning about this problem. And with that, thank you very much. Yes, Kristen.
Thank you. Hold on. Thank you. And I do have to say that I think that answer really reminds me of the answer that Denise gave to the question.
Well, and I don't know. I mean, maybe we could replace NSF program. No, I won't say that.
So I just want to say something, not as a question, but as a statement. So after this hype talk about AI, let me cool down a little bit things. Einstein developed general relativity, which we understand the whole cosmos now through, by basically based on zero facts, zero data. So our human brains are capable of very, very different things. So humans will be needed at least for a while. The second problem with designing a drug for bacteria is that life, unfortunately, relies a lot on random events, random mutations. And when you have something random, you can't predict the future. And this is, as you know, the problem, many of you probably work on that, is the problem of noise. noise in imaging machines, noises in microscopes, and so forth. And so far, AI has been having serious problem generalizing from one machine to another. So humans will be needed, I think, for sure. So that's my answer to that one. And I just want to say one thing. So I was...
Yeah, my job was to give the questions. You guys can give the answers.
In April, we opened a beautiful institute in Bulgaria, which is together with the ETH in Zurich, on AI and machine learning and security insight. And Shafi Goldwasser was there, and she's one of the advisors, and she said, every discovery in AI and encryption and so forth has started with a person with a pen and a paper. And I don't think we have replaced, we will replace the way we do science. Thank you.
Thanks, Krastan. Any other questions, comments? We have plenty of time. Reminder for everyone, we'll have an hour-long discussion after the end of the first session. But please, any questions, comments? So,
what I would call the younger generation shake their head. Oh, yeah, sorry. I used to be a colleague of Slava, you could say. I was a rotating program director, but in SAIS. I don't want to take credit, but I did put the AI stuff in the Molecular Foundations for Biotechnology. I'm an AI researcher. I'm just curious, I noticed some of the younger generation, I want to call them, they shook their heads when Krastan said everything started with pen and paper. So I'm just very curious to hear from them why they were shaking their heads. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, sure, no problem.
Please introduce yourself.
So I'm Ethan Dyer. My background is in physics, and now I try to use that to understand AI systems at Google. So I definitely, have a strong prior for wanting that to be true. I like working things out with pen and paper. But I would say most of the recent developments, so let's say last 4 years, maybe even 10 years in the field of AI, like the, qualitative breakthroughs have mostly been led by empirics and only followed, if at all, by pen and paper work, theory work. And I feel like that's, to some degree, just accelerating, with, as we train these, especially these big language models, but big models at scale, there's like qualitative developments, that we have no idea how to understand theoretically.
Hi there, my name's Tess Smith. I just started off at MIT. Maybe to follow up, to add another perspective to it, I think actually a really big challenge is just articulating what we want in algorithmic form. So actually setting up tasks that actually make sense, or training tasks that actually answer the question that we really want. So I think you're going to need a human for articulating what a human wants. And then I think we can use these tools to make some pretty sophisticated systems for answering those questions. And what are the types of probes we want in those systems, the checks? Do we want to be able to turn things on and off? Like, I think scaffolding those algorithms is still a huge part of where you need the human, because ultimately you're building a tool for the human. So it's not so much that you really need human intelligence in there to like go from X to Y. It's more of, aren't you building this for you? So that's my perspective on it.
But I think, from my perspective, the advantage of the applied work is it's sort of clear in many cases what you want. It's not like we don't need to invent a problem. We know what the problems are. For example, in pathology, we know what we want. We want to know, given the piece of tissue taken from a person, what's the best drug to give them to cure their cancer. So we don't. I'm just commenting. When I was a student in the phase 2 AI life, I was at MIT and I listened to talks by groups of people who thought that they were designing the answer to everything by building blocks. In the work in the AI lab in MIT and in those eras, and I just said, why do I care about stacking blocks on top of one or the other when I have all these problems in the physical world that we want to solve? And so I think we're at the stage where we can solve those problems we can at least tackle those problems in the physical world. And I don't think the list of problems we want to solve is large, and I think we can agree on many of them in advance, and then we can see. So I agree that it matters what problem you choose, and that's going to be done by a human. Presumably the computer doesn't care if we cure cancer or not. But nonetheless, I don't think we don't need to iterate that often, in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I guess maybe to kind of drill on that a little bit more, I would say sometimes it's easy to ask the question, and it's really hard to actually understand what information you would need to actually answer that properly,
sure.
or what infrastructure you would need to answer that properly.
Okay. Yeah, that's certainly true. Yeah.